November 1985. Power Station Studios, New York City. The temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees, but inside Studio A, the air was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Clive Davis sat in the control room, his fingers drumming against the mixing console with the precise rhythm of a man who had spent 40 years mastering every aspect of the music business. He had discovered Janis Joplin when the world thought she was too raw. He had transformed Aretha Franklin's career when others said her best years were behind her. He had turned Barry Manilow into a household name when critics dismissed him as just another lounge singer. But in 4 decades of shaping popular music, through thousands of recording sessions and hundreds of artists, Clive Davis had never once cried during a take. Not when Janis poured her tortured soul into Piece of My Heart. Not when Aretha reached notes that seemed to touch the face of God. Not even when he had to tell artists their careers were over. Clive Davis didn't cry. He made hits. Tonight, that was about to change. Whitney Houston stood in the vocal booth, 22 years old, and carrying the weight of expectations that would have crushed most people twice her age. She wore a simple black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look even younger than she was. But there was nothing simple about what Clive was asking her to do. Greatest Love of All was supposed to be the centerpiece of her debut album, the song that would prove Whitney wasn't just another pretty voice in an industry full of them. The demo had been recorded months earlier, and it was technically perfect. Every note hit precisely where it should be. Every breath controlled and measured. Every phrase balanced and professional. It was everything a debut single should be, except for one thing. It had no soul. Clive knew this, though he hadn't quite admitted it to himself yet. He sat in the control room surrounded by the best session musicians in New York, the finest recording engineers money could buy, and enough vintage equipment to make any audiophile weep with envy. Everything was perfect. That was the problem. Whitney had already done 2 takes that evening, both of them technically flawless and emotionally sterile. The session musicians kept glancing at each other with expressions that said what nobody wanted to speak aloud. This wasn't working. Michael Narada Walden, the producer who had crafted the instrumental track, stood near the door with his arms crossed. He had worked with Aretha, with Diana Ross, with legends who could make you believe every word they sang, even when they were just running scales. He recognized what he was hearing from Whitney. Fear masked as perfection. The anxiety of a young artist so terrified of making a mistake that she had forgotten how to take a risk. Clive spoke into the talkback microphone, his voice carrying that peculiar combination of authority and encouragement that had guided countless artists through difficult sessions. Whitney, that was excellent. Absolutely professional. But I needed to go deeper. Find the emotion in the lyric. Let me hear your heart, not just your technique. Through the control room glass, they watched Whitney nod and adjust her headphones. She closed her eyes and took a long breath. And for a moment Clive saw something flicker across her face. Not fear this time, but something closer to frustration or perhaps resignation. She was trying so hard to give him what he wanted, but the very act of trying was creating a wall between her authentic self and a microphone. The clock on the studio wall showed 11:37 p.m. They had been at this for 6 hours, and everyone in the room could feel the energy shifting from excited anticipation to exhausted obligation. The coffee had gone cold. The sandwiches ordered hours ago sat half-eaten and forgotten. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the room itself was tired of waiting for something real to happen. "Let's try take 3, Clive said, and signaled the engineer to roll tape. What nobody in that studio knew was that in the hallway outside, Sissy Houston had arrived unannounced. Whitney's mother had spent her entire adult life in the music business, singing backup for Elvis, for Aretha, for every major artist who came through New York in the 60s and 70s. She knew how the industry worked, how young black women were packaged and processed and polished until nothing authentic remained. And she was not about to let that happen to her daughter. Sissy had been at home in New Jersey when something she couldn't quite name made her get in her car and drive to Manhattan. Mother's intuition, some would call it. The Holy Spirit, Sissy would say. All she knew was that Whitney needed her. And when your daughter needs you, you don't ask questions. You just go. She pushed through the studio's heavy exterior door and immediately heard Whitney's voice filtering through the hallway speakers. Her daughter was singing Greatest Love of All with the kind of technical precision that would make any vocal coach proud and any mother worried. Because Sissy heard what Clive couldn't hear yet. She heard her daughter performing instead of feeling. She heard Whitney trying to become what white executives wanted instead of offering who she actually was. The assistant engineer in the hallway, a young man named Marcus who had grown up on Sissy's gospel recordings, looked up in surprise when he saw her. "Miss Houston, we didn't know you were coming. Do you want me to tell Whitney you're here?" Sissy shook her head, her eyes fixed on the control room window, where she could see Clive Davis leaning forward with that intense focus he was famous for. "Not yet. Let me listen first." She stood in the hallway in her church coat and modest heels, and she listened to her daughter sing with perfect diction and controlled vibrato, and absolutely none of the fire that Sissy had spent 22 years nurturing. Inside the vocal booth, Whitney was having a conversation with herself that nobody else could hear. She loved Clive Davis, respected him, trusted him to guide her career in ways her mother's generation had never been guided. But she also felt something pulling at her, something that whispered she was losing herself in the pursuit of perfection. The instrumental track started again, and Whitney began the third take of Greatest Love of All with her eyes still closed. But something was different this time. Maybe it was exhaustion lowering her defenses. Maybe it was frustration breaking through her carefully maintained professionalism. Or maybe it was the presence of her mother in the hallway, even though Whitney didn't consciously know Sissy was there. Whatever it was, when Whitney reached the bridge of the song, something in her voice shifted. Her vibrato, which she had been carefully controlling to meet Clive's exacting standards, suddenly loosened. It became wider, warmer, less technically perfect, and infinitely more human. The note she hit on the word love wobbled slightly, breaking the rules of classical vocal technique in a way that somehow made the word mean more than it had in the previous two takes. In the control room, Clive Davis felt something happen in his chest. It was physical, this response to Whitney's voice. His breath caught, his throat tightened, and for the first time in his professional life, he felt tears forming in his eyes. Michael Narado Walden, standing near the door, stopped moving entirely. The session musicians, who had been going through the motions for the past 6 hours, suddenly sat up straighter and played with an intensity they hadn't brought to the previous takes. Everyone in that room felt it. They were witnessing something transcendent. Whitney continued singing, unaware of the effect she was having. Her voice grew stronger as the song progressed, but not in a technical sense. It grew stronger in truth, in vulnerability, in a willingness to let her imperfections show. When she reached the final chorus, her voice cracked slightly on a high note. By classical standards, by technical standards, by every measure that Clive Davis had used to judge vocal performances for 40 years, it was a mistake. But it was the most beautiful mistake anyone in that studio had ever heard, because it was real. It was Whitney Houston being completely, authentically herself without the armor of perfection protecting her from judgment. The song ended, and for several seconds, nobody in the control room moved or spoke. The tape continued rolling, capturing only silence and the sound of Whitney's breathing through the microphone. Clive Davis stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the wall with a soft thud. Everyone in the control room turned to look at him, expecting him to speak, to give notes, to guide them toward the next step. Instead, they watched the most powerful man in the music industry walk toward the door with his hand covering his mouth. "Clive," Michael called after him, concerned. "Are you okay?" But Clive didn't answer. He couldn't answer because if he tried to speak, everyone would hear what was happening to him. He pushed through the control room door, walked past the hallway where Sissy Houston stood watching him with knowing eyes, and found the studio's small bathroom. He locked the door behind him, turned on the faucet to cover any sound, and allowed himself to cry for the first time in his 40-year career. The tears came from somewhere deep, somewhere he had locked away when he decided to make it in the music business. They came from every moment he had prioritized commerce over art, every time he had smoothed away an artist's rough edges to make them more marketable, every compromise he had made in the name of success. Whitney's voice on that third take had broken something open in him. It had reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, before the boardrooms and the marketing meetings and the pressure to deliver hits that could pay for 30-person staffs and multi-million-dollar recording budgets. In that bathroom, with his carefully constructed professional composure cracking like ice in spring, Clive Davis understood something he had been resisting for months. Whitney Houston didn't need him to make her perfect. She needed him to create space for her to be magnificent. Outside in the hallway, Sissy Houston had watched Clive's hasty exit with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being proven right about something you never wanted to be right about. She pushed open the control room door without asking permission and addressed the room in a voice that had commanded gospel choirs and backup sections for 3 decades. "Where's my daughter?" Marcus, the assistant engineer, pointed toward the vocal booth where Whitney still stood with her headphones on, unaware of the chaos her performance had created. Sissy walked straight through the control room, ignoring the startled looks from the session musicians, and opened the door to the vocal booth. Whitney looked up in surprise as her mother entered, and immediately began to cry in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in months. Not from sadness, but from relief at seeing someone who loved her for who she was rather than what she could become. "Mama, what are you doing here?" Sissy pulled her daughter into an embrace that was fierce with protection and love. "The Holy Spirit told me you needed me, and when I heard you singing just now, I knew why." When Clive Davis finally composed himself and returned to the control room, he found Sissy Houston sitting in his chair with her arms crossed and her expression set in a way that made clear this conversation was going to happen whether he wanted it or not. Whitney stood beside her mother, and the resemblance between them was striking, not just in their faces, but in the strength of their posture and the determination in their eyes. "Miss Houston," Clive began, his voice still rough from crying, "I didn't know you were here. We're in the middle of a session, and while I always appreciate your input..." Sissy cut him off with a look that could have stopped traffic. "My daughter has given you 2 perfect takes tonight. Technically perfect, the kind of perfect that wins Grammys and sells records and makes white executives comfortable. And you kept pushing her to do it again. Why?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and everyone in the control room pretended to be very interested in their equipment. Clive took a breath, aware that his answer would determine not just this session, but possibly his entire relationship with the artist who represented his label's future. Because those takes were perfect, but not transcendent. Whitney has a gift that goes beyond technique, and I was trying to help her access it. Sissy's expression didn't soften. By making her doubt herself? By pushing her until she's exhausted and vulnerable? That's not helping, Mr. Davis. That's manipulation. The words hit Clive like a physical blow, partly because they were harsh and partly because they contained a grain of truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He had been manipulating the session, using his authority and experience to push Whitney past her comfort zone. The question was whether that manipulation was in service of art or in service of his own vision of what Whitney should be. "Miss Houston," Clive said carefully, "I have spent 40 years in this business helping artists find their best selves. Sometimes that requires pushing them beyond what they think they're capable of. I would never do anything to hurt Whitney." Sissy stood, and despite being several inches shorter than Clive, she somehow seemed to tower over him. "My daughter has been singing since before she could walk. I know what her best self sounds like, and it doesn't need to be filtered through what you think white audiences will accept. Whitney is a black woman with a black woman's voice, and if you try to polish that away to make her more palatable, you're not helping her find her best self. You're helping her lose it." The silence that followed was broken by Whitney's quiet voice. "Mama, Clive isn't trying to make me less black. He's trying to help me reach everyone, not just one audience." Sissy turned to her daughter with an expression of such fierce love and concern that several people in the control room had to look away. "Baby, I know you believe that, but I've seen this story before. I've watched them do it to Aretha, to Diana, to every black woman who ever had a voice that threatened to be too powerful. They sand away your edges until you're smooth enough not to scare anybody, and by the time you realize what you've lost, it's too late to get it back." Clive Davis looked at Whitney Houston, this extraordinary young woman standing between her mother's protective fury and his carefully constructed vision for her career, and he made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. He could fight Sissy, assert his authority as the producer and executive who had final say over the album. He could explain all the market research and radio formats and demographic targets that justified his approach. He could win this argument through sheer force of industry power. Or he could listen. "Miss Houston," Clive said quietly. "What did you hear in that third take?" Sissy's expression shifted slightly, surprise mixing with her anger. She hadn't expected the question. "I heard my daughter telling the truth. I heard her voice doing what it was born to do instead of what she's been trained to do. I heard Whitney Houston instead of a perfect performance of what Whitney Houston is supposed to be." Clive nodded slowly, processing this. Then he turned to Michael Narada-Walden. "Play back take 3. The producer moved to the mixing board and rewound the 2-inch tape. When Whitney's voice filled the studio again, everyone listened with new awareness. This time they could hear what Sissy had heard immediately. The slight imperfections in Whitney's vibrato weren't flaws. They were signatures of authenticity. The moments where her voice cracked or wavered weren't mistakes. They were human vulnerability made audible. The performance wasn't perfect by technical standards, but it was transcendent by every measure that actually mattered. When the playback ended, Clive looked at Sissy with an expression that was equal parts humility and revelation. "You're right. That's the take." Sissy's anger softened into something closer to cautious respect. "You mean that?" Clive turned to Whitney. "That third take, with all its imperfections and rough edges and moments that break every rule I've spent 40 years learning. That's the greatest vocal performance I've ever recorded. It made me cry, Whitney. In 40 years, I have never cried during a session. Your voice did something to me that I can't explain and don't fully understand. And I know that if it affected me that way, it's going to affect millions of other people the same way." Whitney looked between her mother and Clive, understanding that she was witnessing a rare moment when two powerful people who loved her were finding common ground. "But what about radio?" she asked quietly. "What about the markets that want everything smooth and perfect? Won't they reject it because it's too raw?" Clive smiled, and it was the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all night. "Then they'll reject it. But I don't think they will, because what you did in that booth wasn't too raw. It was exactly raw enough. You showed people your heart, Whitney. You let them see the real person behind the technique. And that's what makes legends. Not perfection, but truth." He turned to the engineer. "That's our master take. Don't touch it, don't fix it, don't smooth anything out. Whitney's voice on take 3 is what goes on the album." The session ended at 2:30 in the morning with a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the clock and everything to do with the emotional journey everyone had traveled. Sissy Houston kissed her daughter goodnight and shook Clive's hand with a grip that was firm but no longer combative. "Take care of her," she told him. "Not just her career. Her." Clive nodded, understanding that he had been given both a blessing and a warning. After Sissy left, Whitney and Clive sat in the control room, listening to the third take one more time. This time without the pressure of the session, without the weight of expectations, just two people listening to something beautiful and true. "I was scared," Whitney admitted quietly. "During that take, I felt like I was losing control, like my voice was doing things I hadn't planned. I almost stopped and asked to do it again." Clive looked at her with an expression of such genuine respect that Whitney felt tears forming again. "That's when you were most in control. Not control of your technique, but control of your truth. Do you understand the difference?" Whitney thought about this. "I think so. It's like the difference between singing the notes and meaning the words." Clive smiled. "Exactly. And tonight, for the first time, you meant every single word. You let us see your vulnerability, and that vulnerability is what makes you unstoppable." Over the next few months, as Whitney's debut album took shape, Clive found himself returning again and again to the lesson of that third take. He began to listen differently to the other songs, hearing not just for technical perfection, but for moments of authentic humanity. When Whitney's voice did something unexpected or imperfect, instead of immediately asking for another take, he would pause and consider whether that imperfection might actually be the most perfect thing about the performance. The album was released in February 1985, and Greatest Love of All became not just a hit, but a cultural phenomenon. Radio programmers, who Clive had worried might reject the rawness of Whitney's vocal, instead embraced it precisely because it felt real in a landscape of overproduced pop perfection. The song reached #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks, but more importantly, it established Whitney Houston as an artist who could make people feel something genuine in an era of manufactured emotion. Critics who heard the album noted that there was something different about Whitney's voice, something that set her apart from the other technically gifted singers flooding the market. They couldn't always articulate what that difference was, but listeners knew. They heard someone who was willing to be imperfect in service of being truthful, and that authenticity created a connection that transcended genre and demographic and every other category the music industry used to organize and control its artists. Years later, Clive Davis would tell the story of that recording session to young artists he was developing, always emphasizing the same lesson. Technical perfection is admirable, but emotional authenticity is irreplaceable. He would describe standing in that bathroom at Power Station Studios, crying for the first time in his career, and how that moment taught him that his job wasn't to make artists perfect. It was to create conditions where they felt safe enough to be imperfect. Sissy Houston, for her part, never fully trusted the music industry's machinery, but she developed a grudging respect for Clive Davis as one of the few executives who was capable of learning and changing. She would later say that the night she confronted him in the studio was the night she knew Whitney's career might actually survive with her soul intact. Not because Clive had all the answers, but because he had been willing to admit he didn't. The album was released in February 1985, and Greatest Love of All became not just a hit, but a cultural phenomenon. Radio programmers, who Clive had worried might reject the rawness of Whitney's vocal, instead embraced it precisely because it felt real in a landscape of overproduced pop perfection. The song reached #1 and stayed there for 3 weeks, but more importantly, it established Whitney Houston as an artist who could make people feel something genuine in an era of manufactured emotion. Critics who heard the album noted that there was something different about Whitney's voice, something that set her apart from the other technically gifted singers flooding the market. They couldn't always articulate what that difference was, but listeners knew. They heard someone who was willing to be imperfect in service of being truthful, and that authenticity created a connection that transcended genre and demographic and every other category the music industry used to organize and control its artists. Years later, Clive Davis would tell the story of that recording session to young artists he was developing, always emphasizing the same lesson. Technical perfection is admirable, but emotional authenticity is irreplaceable. He would describe standing in that bathroom at Power Station Studios, crying for the first time in his career, and how that moment taught him that his job wasn't to make artists perfect. It was to create conditions where they felt safe enough to be imperfect. Sissy Houston, for her part, never fully trusted the music industry's machinery, but she developed a grudging respect for Clive Davis as one of the few executives who was capable of learning and changing. She would later say that the night she confronted him in the studio was the night she knew Whitney's career might actually survive with her soul intact. Not because Clive had all the answers, but because he had been willing to admit he didn't. Whitney herself carried the memory of that third take throughout her career, returning to it whenever she felt pressured to be something other than herself. In interviews, she would describe it as the moment she learned that her imperfections weren't obstacles to overcome, but gifts to embrace. That's when I understood that my vibrato, which doesn't always behave the way it's supposed to, is actually my signature, she would explain. It's the thing that makes my voice mine instead of just another technically perfect instrument. The recording of Greatest Love of All from that November night in 1985 has been analyzed by vocal coaches, studied by music students, and dissected by audio engineers for decades. They all try to identify exactly what makes Whitney's performance so affecting, cataloging the moments where her technique breaks and her humanity shines through. But the real magic of that take can't be reduced to technical analysis, because it exists in the space between perfection and imperfection, in the courage to be vulnerable in front of strangers, and in the willingness to trust that truth is more powerful than polish. Clive Davis kept a photograph from that session in his office for the rest of his career. It shows Whitney in the vocal booth with her eyes closed and her hand pressed against the headphones, lost in the moment of the third take. He would look at it whenever he felt tempted to prioritize marketability over authenticity, and it would remind him of the night he learned to cry. Because that's what Whitney's voice had taught him, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to control everything and just allow beauty to exist on its own terms. That the imperfections we spend so much energy trying to hide or fix are often the very things that make us irreplaceable. And that true artistry requires the courage to be vulnerable enough to fail, because only in risking failure can we achieve transcendence. The take that made Clive Davis cry wasn't perfect by any technical measure. Whitney's vibrato wobbled, her voice cracked on high notes, and there were moments when her breath control wasn't as pristine as it had been in the previous two takes. But it was real, and realness is the rarest commodity in an industry built on illusion and manufacture emotion. That third take of Greatest Love of All became the master recording that appeared on Whitney Houston's debut album. It went on to sell over 25 million copies worldwide, launched one of the most successful careers in music history, and created a template for authentic vocal performance that influenced generations of singers who came after. But for Clive Davis, sitting in that control room at 2:30 in the morning with tears on his face and humility in his heart, the real success wasn't measured in sales or accolades. It was measured in the moment when he stopped trying to shape Whitney Houston into his vision of perfection and instead allowed her to show him what transcendence actually sounded like.